Nothing like having the session right after lunch on the last day of the conference after everyone has had so much to do and so much information coming at you. So we're going to work really hard to make this as entertaining as possible. I'm going to have Ellie do some dances here in a minute. I was kidding, but see, I can almost make her do anything. Yeah. It's kind of interesting.
We're European. We do all these weird things anyway, so there you go.
Well, I'm really excited to be here, even though it is the last day of the conference, and I'm excited that all of you took the time to come and join us to talk about my absolute favorite topic, which is how do employees help you drive your business success. My name is Grace Black, and I lead our advisory team at Medallia, so I've been at Medallia for about 6 years. This is my partner in crime, Ellie. She'll tell you a little bit about herself just in a moment, but did want to let you guys know that she's supposed to be up here with me. All right, so what are we going to do today? I really want to talk about this topic that I feel is sometimes not a popular topic, and sometimes people oversee it. They just don't think about it, obviously, all the time. So we want to make sure that we understand the connection between your employees and your customers is crucial to driving business success. And so what we'll talk about today is why. Why is it so important to understand both sides of the experience? We'll talk a little bit about what gets in the way and help think about how do we make a business case for making sure that there's good alignment between these teams, these strategies, and the data that we're coming in. We're sharing all of the insights. We're going to talk about how to break down silos from two perspectives. How do we break down the people silo? That's number one. And then Ellie's going to take us through the end and talk about what do we do with the data and how do we break down those data silos. We have a couple of real life examples and some other fun information throughout. So buckle up and get ready. We're going to have some fun, I hope. All right. So to get us started, I do have a little activity. I hope you guys are all excited for some exercise. Just kidding. But by shows of hand, how many of you have had a positive customer experience recently? You're the customer, you've gone somewhere, and you've had a really positive experience. That's it? More? Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to call anybody out. All right, now let's think about, just for 1 second, you don't have to tell me, but think about what were the two main behaviors during that positive experience that made it so positive from the person that you were interacting with. Now take that, put a pin in it, and now let's think about who's had a terrible customer experience recently? Now, this one I'm glad to see that not as many of you, but there are some out there. So what was the difference? If you start to think about those behaviors, what were the differences between that customer experience that was great and the one that wasn't as great? I'm going to pretend to read your mind, and I'm going to say that the biggest differences were most likely the people, the employee that you were interacting with, right? So you think about three things that really drive customer experience, and that is how engaged your employees are, how empowered they are, and most importantly, whether or not they have the right tools, support, culture, and knowledge to effectively take care of your customer. You've probably been to a bunch of these conferences where those three things didn't come up as the top three things that drive customer experiences. But what if I told you that more often than not, it does come down to the employee, and it comes down to the things that drive their experiences. So let's dive into these just a little bit. I'll double click into employee engagement. And I hear so many times, engagement is really fluffy. What do we do with it? What does it mean? Why do we care? We care because when employees are engaged and they feel valued, they're going to go to the extra mile to take care of their customer because in their eyes, engaged employees feel like that is their customer. That's not their brand's customer. It's not their manager's customer. It's their customer. So they're going to go to all the power that they have to make sure that they're doing the best job that they can do. Number two is empowerment. We have to empower our people and make sure that they have the autonomy to make decisions in the moment. And if your employees are not engaged, whether you tell them that they're empowered or not, they're not going to take the initiative to solve problems and to make sure that they're doing the things that they need to do for customers to be happy, successful, and getting the experience that you're telling them that they're going to get. So empowerment is that other really powerful tool that we can tell employees all day long, hey, you're empowered to do what you need to do. But if they lack engagement, they're going to lack initiative. So being engaged and having an experience and support within your organization is going to really help people own that empowerment and own the experience. Last, but definitely not least, most important if you take away anything from today, is that I don't care how engaged you are, how empowered you feel, if you don't have the tools, the resources, and the knowledge to do your job, you're not going to be able to provide that high level of experience for your customers. So if you think about employee experience, and I started out saying, because I hear it all the time, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I started when I was 14. I hear it, it's fluffy, it's soft. I don't get it, I don't understand it. But there is a lot of data to support how focusing on employee experience should be part of the CX strategy. Because you're talking about the folks who are making the widgets, talking to the customers, returning the phone calls, answering the problems. These people are your business. It's important. So research shows that companies that have highly engaged employees are 21% more profitable. And then when you think about customer satisfaction, we have companies that tell us we invest in the employee experience and we realize that it's important. They are 2 times higher, they have 2 times higher customer satisfaction. You guys believe that? Yes. Oh, I love you guys. This is like awesome. Okay, and lastly, the most costly part of running a business, retention, right? Trying to find the right people, training them up, giving them the skills, getting them engaged, doing all of that is costly. So if you do that and 6 months later they leave, it really, really can impact your ability to really take care of your customers. So 87% of employees who are considered highly engaged also say that they're not looking for another job. They're happy where they are. So engagement drives that very costly business expense, which is retention. So are you guys sold now that this is important? Yeah. Awesome. Because really where we want to focus our efforts, not that I didn't think any of you came here thinking it wasn't, but really what I want to make sure that we focus on today is the how. So I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of a story. So this was a client, global auto dealer, who had many, many locations across the globe. And they came to us and said, we're really struggling with our NPS scores. Our customers are not happy. We're getting really low customer satisfaction scores. Can you help us understand why? On the flip side of that, we were able to talk to the EX team, and we found that their engagement scores were dipping and that their employees weren't really as engaged as they had been in prior years. So after we dug into it a little bit more, what we found was 2 main things. One, EX and CX were not talking to each other, so they were working very siloed. And the employees didn't feel like they were connected to the vision. They didn't, what are we doing anyway? Where are we going? Where's that North Star? They didn't have that information. They also weren't seeing the data that we were collecting from the customers. So they didn't know what the customer was feeling, but what they did know is that their processes were very hard, very cumbersome, very timely, and it was upsetting the customer, which was making them frustrated. So we're going to get into the solution, the results of the solution in a minute. Ellie will tell you about that. But what we did is we brought those teams together and we said, what can we learn from both sides of this very important equation that has to work together? So what we did was we brought the CX and EX teams together. We brought in senior leadership and said, come on, let's have a rally. Let's get behind both of these really important pieces of data that we have. And let's try to understand how we make the employee's life easier and how that's going to impact the customer. And so we did that, putting data together. So when we think about your organizations, how many of you are now collecting both employee and customer data? Oh, good. Awesome. How many are you doing it together? Oh, okay. Awesome. So we have a couple of people that are doing it together. I love that. So what we want to really hone in on and start to talk about is, what are the things that get in the way of doing it? I can almost imagine that some of you are out there thinking, because remember, I read minds and I know things. What I think you're thinking is, this sounds great. Yeah, let's do it. Let's connect CX and EX. I think it would be great. But man, it feels hard. How are we going to do that? And it doesn't have to be hard. So it really just takes a little bit of effort in getting the right people in place to start having the conversations about the data, the people, the insights. So the number one thing is really thinking about your organizational silos and structure. So in most organizations that I've worked with, your CX team is managed by the marketing department or customer success or operations. And over here, your EX program is managed by HR. HR's thinking about, oh, I gotta hire more people, I gotta hire the right people, we need to be productive, we need to make sure that we're communicating. And over here, CX is talking about, what are these customer interactions, how are we doing, how's our NPS score? And they're not talking to each other to feed off of each other. So I think I've heard it in a couple of the sessions today, and I'm gonna repeat it. But experience is a team sport, and it takes every individual in your organization to drive the customer experience. So we need to make sure that we're bringing all of those teams together. We'll dive into that just a little bit in a minute. The second thing is the metrics. So CX isn't, they care about NPS, they care about sales revenue and year-over-year growth and those types of metrics. HR is talking about the cost of retention and training and compliance stuff, and they have those types of metrics. So the number two thing that we need to do is decide and understand for our customers, what are the metrics that we can combine, that we can work together to drive. CX is going to always have their metrics. EX is always going to have their metrics. But when we start to look at the metrics that drive the experience for both employees and customers together, is where we start to get insights and understand better the experiences of both so that we understand how to make it better for the customer. And then the last piece, and most importantly, is also bringing data together. So you might not be doing CX and EX in the same platform. You might be doing it in the same platform, but not connecting the information. So really understanding your data, where it's coming from, and where we can find those connections between the data that we have coming in. And I'm not talking about just survey data. So think about HRIS data. What are we collecting? What do we know about absenteeism? What do we know about turnover? What do we know about people who've been in role over a certain amount of time and not moved, not improved, not grown in their role? Like, there's a lot of signals out there within your data that we can bring in and also start to see how all of those things ultimately impact the customer experience. So when you leave here today, think about, if I need to improve my CX strategy, what do? You focus on improving the employee experience. A little bit more statistics, and we won't spend a lot of time on these, but just again, to just wrap this back up, successful companies build cross-functional teams that align their CX and EX strategies. So these people work together, they activate their employees. So what I mean by activating my employees is putting the right data in their hands, letting them understand. Nobody gets up in the morning and goes, I'm gonna go to work today and do a horrible job. Just gonna make all my customers mad. No, we get up in the morning, we're positive, we wanna go to work, we wanna do a good job, but we need that information. So making sure that we're putting customer feedback in the hands of the people who can impact meaningful change, your employees. And if you do that, and companies that do that are 2.5 times more likely to meet or exceed their financial targets. When companies remove silos and bring those teams together and really start to collaborate and use the feedback that they're getting from their employees to drive customer satisfaction, almost 3 times more likely to be voted as a great place to work. I think that's pretty powerful. When you can tell your customers that not only is this a great place for you to come shop or do business or whatever, that it's also a great place to work, it really does start to build that loyalty from those customers. And then lastly, they drive operational excellence. And they do that connecting the data and understanding the experiences. So they're over 3 times more likely to have higher retention, and that's higher customer retention, which is also expensive if you're losing a lot of customers, right? but also employee retention. So we're keeping a good, stable workforce that ultimately builds a culture that your customers can depend on. And so you have the same experience from one unit to another, from one location to another. It's consistent because we have those people in place that have been with us. They know the culture. All right, so the burning question in everybody's mind: how do we get these people to work together? So thinking about organizations that foster a culture of collaboration. That means everyone's thoughts and opinions are welcome, and we want to learn from each other. We want to learn from our customers. So you have an executive team that you bring together. You want to make sure that you're touching all different parts of the organization. So we're bringing in people from product, from marketing, from customer experience, from HR, from training. We're bringing all the right people, and that combination of folks might be different at your organization, but making sure that all the people that can drive meaningful change, you have some level of leadership sponsors who are going to come in and stand behind all of the initiatives that you're doing. You're then going to create a format for these teams to come together where you have regular meetings, regular cadence to bring in your customer data and your employee data. And to understand how do we map those journeys and understand, and Ellie's going to get into this a little bit more detail about connecting the right data at the right times, but really bringing in and having that structure and that foundation ready to do something with that data when it comes in. So you have some governance around who's going to own what, how are we going to action, how are we going to share experiences. So you bring in all of these folks, and then you activate your employees. And what I mean by that is you give your employees some form of feedback mechanism to give you information in the moment while I'm doing work. Because I'm not going to remember 6 months from now when it's time to do my engagement survey that if we had a widget over here, I could cut 10 minutes off how long it takes me to open a new bank account for a customer or make a sandwich or whatever the thing may be. They have the information. They know what's broken, and they have some good ideas on how to fix it. So bringing all of these groups together and holding them, one, accountable, and also making sure before you can hold them accountable that you're giving them everything that they need. You're combining these dashboards or this data or however you want to combine it, but your frontline employees understand how your customer's feeling and what are the things that they can do to change that experience for your customers. Your customers are going to feel better. Your employees are going to feel better. These are the 4 things that I want you to take away from, like, here's what I'm going to go do when I leave here, right? We're going to really start to think about connecting our CX and EX teams. I'm not going to call anybody out, but I did meet someone here at the conference who said, I'm here from our EX practice, and there's some folks from my company, I've never met them, they run our CX practice. So we're going to make that go away. And we're going to make sure that we know each other, that we're working together, that we have a vision that brings us together. We can all work towards that same goal. And we all understand what are the different things that we need to do to get us there. Then we're going to measure both EX and CX together. And not just measure it together, but we need to make sure that we're bringing it together, that we're using the insights of what our employees are telling us to drive those changes that we need to drive in our customer experience. We're going to empower our employees. And when we empower our employees, we're going to stand behind them and support them when they do it, when they make that decision. Sometimes they might not get it right, but we're going to support them. We're going to work through why it wasn't right and what we could have done differently, but we're not going to get mad at them or punish them for taking the initiative to solve a client's problem. And we're going to foster this culture of alignment in everything that we do. So we're going to talk about the customer and the employee in the same breath. We're going to make sure that our employees feel as important to our organizations as our customers do. And we're going to make sure that they have all the data and that they are involved in solving whatever the solutions are. They have a wealth of knowledge, and they can really help drive the experience. So my last sentence, and then I'll pass this over to Ellie, which I really just wanted to get up here and only say this to begin with, but they wouldn't let me. They said I had to say a lot of other words. But you cannot expect world-class customer experiences from employees who are having poor employee experiences. It's not going to happen. All right, so with that, I've talked about the silos and the people side of it, and Ellie will entertain you. They're still awake, so it's on you.
I was going to say...
with the data part.
Well, yeah, I think when we start going into actual more technicalities of linkage analysis, you might go to sleep, which is absolutely fine. Firstly, thank you, Grace, for kind of going through those important considerations and approaches to thinking about breaking down those internal silos when we want to bring together employee and customer, enabling us to give those great brand experiences. So I'm going to say hello. I am here. My name is Eleanore and I run International Advisory based out of London, as you can probably guess from the accent. And I promise no more dancing, but I will be taking you through today the technicalities, the more technical aspects of creating linkage. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to start going into lots of equations. If people are interested in lots of equations, that is also my background. I've got a master's in stats. I could bore you for hours, but today we're going to talk about it on a more practical level so that we can not only bring our organization together, but we can also think about bringing our data together. So again, before we go into this in a little bit more detail, I'm going to just ask a poll, try to wake us all up. Again, how many of you are currently sharing customer feedback with your employees in the front line? I'm hoping the majority of you are. And I think that's really great if you think about it, because the whole concept of linkage is all about sharing information together, sharing customer and employee, allowing us to make the right decisions to create great experiences, whether those experiences be for the employees or for the customers. It's about bringing information together. I think this is obviously often a misconception about what linkage is. Everyone goes straight to statistics. Statistics can play a part, and an important part, but there's much more to it than that. So today I'm going to talk about 3 distinct approaches, okay, to how we might actually do this. So the first one is quantitative linkage, and I think that's where we all feel a little bit comfortable. Let's take some numbers and put them together, okay? And this is a really valid thing to do, because at the end of the day, we often have senior leadership that want to be able to see the numbers, the power of numbers. If I do X, I'm going to achieve Y. And that's where quantitative linkage can have a great impact to be able to let us know how much we're going to gain by focusing in on our employees. The other great thing it does is help us understand more the interactions, the distinct interactions that we might have between the drivers in our survey, allowing us to pinpoint locations for change. But it doesn't just have to be quantitative. Let's face it, there's been so much discussion in this conference about unstructured data, about qualitative data. And just like we can link together our quantitative data, we can bring together our qualitative data. And if you think about the power of qualitative data to take us beyond the what to the why and the how, being able to create those aligned actions and create the right messaging can be really, really crucial. And finally, we're going to talk about employee activation. I know it's probably employee activation, but actually, if you think about it, linkage isn't just about, like I said, numbers. It's about linking the ideas. And in this case, the ideas that our employees have to be able to deliver better experiences for our customers and also better experiences for themselves. When we think about these things, there's 2 things I want you to consider. Firstly, you don't have to do these things in isolation. It's not an either or, well, I might want to do some qualitative or some quantitative. They're actually, the biggest gain is when you think about them in combination, when you put them together. And we'll talk about a little bit about that later in some of the use cases. The other thing is deciding which way you want to go. And this can be, well, which one do I want to do? Well, actually, I'm a huge believer with design in the end in mind. So when we're looking at this, we want to say, what am I trying to achieve? What am I asking myself that I want to do? And also, what data do I actually have available to do this with? Because at the end of the day, you might want to do all kinds of things, but if the data isn't available and it's not answering the right question, then you might as well not start doing it in the first place. So quantitative linkage, like I said, this is the one we all kind of, I think, feel most familiar with. The whole aim of it being this kind of great idea of being able to say, right, if I invest in my employees and if I drive up the way I'm delivering those experiences, going back to that important data that Grace was sharing earlier, I should be able to create better experiences and could drive business outcomes. And we all know that information is exceptionally powerful for leadership buy-in. It's like that aha moment. Why am I doing this? Going back to, it's not fluffy, it's actually got a real business purpose. And like I said, the other thing is those linkages, and I think it was mentioned this morning in the keynote session, that it's not always as simple as saying, right, I'm going to do linkage directly at, I want to look at my engagement directly to my NPS. Sometimes the relationships go deeper than that. So if you think about the example this morning, the perception of knowledge that customers have, yes, it might have a relationship with engagement, but actually maybe the bigger impact is associated with the tools or the training or the development that those individuals are actually having. So being able to bring that data together helps us pinpoint, here's my customer pain point. What do I need to do from my employee perspective in order to actually get there? So let's look at some methods. Everyone loves a good method, right? And again, I'm going to remind ourselves, the nature of the method that we choose to use will also be slightly dependent on the information that we have available and the outcome that we're looking for. So let's look at these just quickly in turn, and then we're going to kind of bring it to life with some use cases. We'll start with connection at the employee level. So what does connection at the employee level mean when we're doing quantitative linkage analysis? We have our employees, and we have information on our employees about how engaged they are, how much training they have, maybe what kind of, how long they've been, the tenure they've been at the organization. So we have all this information about our employees. And then those employees are delivering experiences to customers. So by linking that information about that employee with the information we're collecting from the customers, we can start getting a viewpoint to say, does greater engagement in our employees result in those greater experiences that our customers are having? And we can start aggregating that up within the organization. Now, there can be some trickiness associated with employee level linkage. The first one is sometimes it's not easy to have that information available. Sometimes, especially at the customer level, we might not know which particular employee delivered that experience. So that can create some kind of difficulties. The other thing that we need to think very carefully about when we're bringing this data together is confidentiality. We can't just say, hey, I'm going to throw confidentiality out now because I'm doing some linkage analysis. No. We can't do that. We have rules for a reason. We want people to feel safe when they're filling in this information. So, thinking about can we actually do this and where we want to do it. Maybe if we're doing this kind of linkage analysis, we take it offline. We don't keep it connected within the tools that we're using to communicate. So often the one I see used more often than employee is what I would call unit level. And what do we mean by unit? A unit is really any kind of interaction point. And it can actually be an employee. But in this case, I'm saying about it could be a restaurant. It could be a hotel. It could be a bank branch. It could be a contact center team rather than the individual agent. And again, we can collect a lot of information about that team. What's the average tenure of the team? How engaged is that team? How much training and development have they had? And then relate it to the experiences that they're giving. And again, by aggregating that information up, we can start creating those return on investments, understanding the impact it has, as well as those important critical interactions. So the next one we're going to talk about is experience level. So if we think about how we think about customer experiences, we talk about customer experience journeys, customer experience touchpoints, how are customers interacting with us and our organizations. But a lot of those connections and those interactions directly have employees that are delivering them. So when we think about connecting at the experience level, we're saying, okay, I've got a customer who's contacting my contact center. They're doing a specific task. They're doing a specific interaction. And we can know what those customers are experiencing. But the employees also know what they're experiencing because they're experiencing it too. They're delivering that experience. So by going out to those employees and saying, hey guys, what are you experiencing when you're trying to deliver this? What are you finding are the pain points? What are you seeing? We can then start looking at those experiences from an amazing 360 view, from what the customer pain points are to how the employees feel about the way they deliver those experiences. The last one I want to talk about is connection at a global level. And by connection at a global level, everyone goes with quantitative linkage and has an idea of a nice big statistical model with lots of numbers and standardized beta coefficients and R-squareds and all of those wonderful things that we're used to. It doesn't have to be that complicated. And I've spoken a lot in the RC experts over time about saying, let's not get caught up sometimes in the complexity. Just bringing the data together, just sharing the understanding, whether it be from like a global level all the way down to the employee, can be such a powerful message for cultural transformation. It really can make a big difference for us to have the information that we need to help us drive those actions. So let's have a look at some of the use cases. Grace did a great job earlier of kind of talking about this kind of automotive case study, as well as being able to kind of use it as a case study to how we should think about organizing and bringing the right people together to find solutions. They also did this from a data point of view. So they looked very much like, here's how my employees are engaged, and here's the things that they're experiencing, and here's my customer information, and this is what is experiencing. And they went one level above, and they said also, well, let's look at the financials. Let's actually look at this in relation to, how profitable, how well are these dealerships doing? Can we create that linkage? And as you can see, they found a really powerful message in terms of, working that story through. What does 1 point of engagement within our workforce mean in terms of the increase in sales that we're likely to find within our network? Now, that number might not be perfect. It might not be an actual, you might get a deviation, but the point is it's demonstrating a story. It's demonstrating the power. And that creates two really important things. From a senior leadership perspective, it's buy-in. Hey, this is money. I'm going to be more profitable. I've got happy customers. I'm going to make more money. But it isn't just in terms of leadership. They used it to activate the network, to get not just the senior people, but the people who were involved in those dealerships, understanding why this was so important and getting them behind the initiative. And we need the organization behind the initiative if we're going to be successful. Mirroring, we talked about this. So we talked about kind of connected experiences. And another way that I kind of talk about it is mirroring, because we're mirroring the customer experience from our employees as well. And this is a case study from a telco company. They'd identified from their customer experience that they had a big problem with account transfers. And so what they did was then they said, okay, well, we understand that we've got customers saying, gosh, this is taking so long. We're having to speak to so many people. Why is this so complicated? So the customer doesn't know why it was so complicated. They can't tell you what's happening in the background. They know that they're experiencing pain point. They know it's really annoying for them, but they don't know why. So they went out and spoke to the call center staff, the employees who are actually delivering those experiences. And they came up with a completely different side of it. They said, well, there's no way I can do that. I don't have access to the right systems. I don't have the autonomy. I have to pass it over to Joe, and Joe has to pass it to Fred and to Susan and everyone else. So at the end of the day, by bringing those two things together, they were saying, here's my pain point. This is what's annoying my customers. Here's why it is happening, so that now I can have a tangibility in terms of what I need to action within my organization to make it better. And what's really important here is, these employees were also saying, this is really annoying me. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want it to be this hard. This isn't great for me as an employee. I'm having to deal with angry customers on the phone. None of us like to deal with angry customers. We like to deal with happy customers. Everything is nice when it's, a little bit more kind of pleasant. And at the end of the day, when they started to alleviate this pain point, not only did they see increases in terms of customer satisfaction, but also greater engagement and satisfaction with the employees that are actually delivering it. I'm going to finish with global connection because, again, all of these things we're sitting there thinking, going back to the hardness, can seem really hard. How do I find the right data? How do I know that I have the right linkage points? What am I going to do? Well, actually, like I said, it sometimes doesn't need to be as hard as it seems. Sometimes, like I said, it's just bringing information together to help us define what is important to both sets of people so we can start to make connected actions, okay? And a bit of a plug for Medallia, and Medallia does make it easier. If you have your data, it doesn't mean you have to have your data to do linkage analysis, but it does make it easier when it's in one place. And the Medallia platform does allow you to bring that information together so that you're sharing the insights, whether it be, from a qualitative basis or a quantitative basis, that information. And that can happen from a global level all the way down, if you think about it, to a branch. Can you imagine the empowerment of saying, okay, well, this is what my customers are experiencing, and this is how my employees are feeling. How can I find things that are going to kind of impact them both and make them both happy? Because going back to, again, this morning, sometimes things that can make employees happy are not necessarily going to make your customers happy. If you think about, flexible working, it'd be great for none of us to ever have to go into the office, but that's not going to make it very easy for people to go into a branch. Technicalities. Everyone enjoys a good bit of technicality, but it is important. So, if we are going to start doing linkage, there are some things I want you to take away to consider thinking about. The first one is going back to Grace's point, what metrics do you have available to you? What is out there for you to work with? And don't always think, because I've got a customer NPS, I've got to have employee NPS. No, that's not how it works. What is it? Finding the right metric that's going to help you tell the story most effectively. You do not have to have aligned metrics. You have to have the right metrics. Then you need to think about linkage points. Remember, we talked about employee unit. How can you bring this together? And where is it sensible to bring it together? This is where a lot of organizations fall down. I'm just going to link everything together. Well, that might be a little bit difficult to achieve. So think about where you can actually bring that data together. Timeframes. We live in a world of continuous data collection often in our customer world. But in our employee world, sometimes we only do maybe biannual engagement surveys. If you think about trying to connect experiences where they're happening at very, very different timeframes, that can be difficult. So think about, is there different ways that we need to start thinking about collecting our employees' experience so that we're gaining more information more often? Or if we're going to do our linkage analysis, let's align it to the right time so that we have the maximum benefit to do it. And it was interesting because in the Mug session on Monday, there was a couple of ladies talked exactly about that. They do their linkage analysis not long after their engagement survey so that they kind of know that, they have the right periodicity. And finally, always consider confidentiality when you're bringing this together, and we're talking about especially that global connections and bringing information together. Don't think because we're not just in the the EX world anymore that we can forget about that stuff. It is really important to make sure that everyone feels safe. Qualitative. I don't need to go into a lot of the methods because a lot of the methods we talked about in terms of bringing the data together are the same for qualitative as they are for quantitative. The difference here is the nature of the information that we're connecting. We're not looking just at numbers. We're thinking about textual information. We're talking about chats. All of this stuff can still be brought together to tell really, really powerful stories. And we know that this information goes well beyond like I said, that kind of what to that why and that how, really giving us a lot of rich insight. And we can bring this together in the platform just in the same way. We can do it in terms of our numerics. And we can also convert a lot of our unstructured data into numerics in the same way. If you think a lot of you probably use text analytics, there we are, taking all of this unstructured data, putting it together in a way that makes sense, and then linking the topics that both are talking about to create those actions, but still with the ability to link into the stories, get that rich insight. And combining the two is really powerful as well, because at the end of the day, we go back to the stories associated with creating that aha moment to leadership. If you focus in on your employees, it's going to be good for your customers. But it might not always tell you everything that you need to do. So I was working, one of my clients, we had an amazing conversation, we're delivering this to the board and everything else, and they, complete buy-in. And then we came out of the meeting and we were like, okay, well, what do we do? The next thing we did was we brought together and we mined the information from customers and from employees, brought that together to create the actions and the outcomes that then were needed to then drive the change forward. So like I said, think about them in combination. The other thing is we don't need to also think about it in a linear way. We know, going back to this morning, it's not always a simple story of happy employee equals happy customer. We can have different ways and approaches and segments of the way people are behaving. So thinking about, creating these different groups for maybe highly engaged customers and low engagement for our employees and low satisfaction for our customers. But one that often is really important that's forgotten about is where we're seeing very high customer scores, but very low employee scores. Because that's probably where they're desperate to try to deliver, but they can't. They haven't got the tools, they haven't got the resources. So by being able to look at that in terms of segment by different types of behaviors and different types of ways that we're looking at it, can again help us tell a really powerful story to make sure we're doing the right actions in the right place. This is the final thing about these. I want us to remember, again, that linkage does not just have to happen through surveys. It's data. Data can be linked together. It doesn't have to be surveys. And one of the ones I loved was this this was years ago. I was working with another automotive client, and it was all about, they had a big problem with first-time fix in their workshops. And we were saying, okay, well, we weren't finding a great relationship directly with the engagement of the employees. But when we went one level down to their technicians, we found that there was an amazing relationship between the levels of the technicians, the training and activation they got, and all of that information then linked much more effectively with the outcome than we actually found by doing engagement. And then actually going forward, we didn't even need the surveys anymore because we were then able to link with the operational metrics they were collecting in the system about how many cars were coming in second, third time because they hadn't been dealt with correctly in the beginning. So again, don't always think of surveys. Finally, employee activation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I think Grace covered it already in a lot of detail. I always want us to think about the fact that when we're looking and bringing this data together, it is innately linking. We're linking employee ideas to being able to deliver customer solutions. And when we're doing that, it goes beyond, like I said, just helping our customers. It's very engaging for employees to be part of the solution. They want to be there. They know that, like I said, all of us know, we all work in our companies. I mean, how many times do we sit there every day going, well, I wish this was better, and I know if we did it this way, it would be much easier. So all of us have ideas, so the more that we can share and use those to deliver more effectively, the better. Like I said, it can be from innovating from within or from mirroring, and importantly, here's an example that we had, and again, another telco company, but could be anyone. But they had a big, going back to strategy, they had a big aligned strategy. We know we're a big, complicated organization, and we want to ensure that we're creating a greater degree of simplicity, both for our employees and for our customers. But they didn't really know how to go about it. They're like, my goodness, we're so big, there's so much we can actually do. Where do we start? So they started with their employees. They went out and said, okay, let's start understanding, let's go out and ask them what needs to be simplified. What needs to be simplified both from helping you just on a day-to-day basis as well as delivering to your customers. And they got over 38,000 pieces of feedback. Just take that for a second. 38,000. I mean, it's a fairly big company, but there's still, people took their time to share that insight in terms of where they wanted the simplification. And they were able to use it really effectively, to then identify the systems, identify the processes, they even gave feedback on the kind of training to be able to really then drive the changes that were needed. And the great thing was that this wasn't just frontline. Yes, frontline was involved, and the amazing information they provided has made huge impacts on the customer experience. But this was also internal systems. And as a result, they've relooked at their performance process. They've looked at expense systems, all kinds of things, procurement, all these things that were creating pain points. And downstream, that creates great organizational efficiencies. So you'll be glad to know. So when we think about call to action, you've had so much stuff kind of thrown at you, not just now, but over the last couple of days. But one of the things I would say is if you are interested in doing this, if this is something that you think is important to yourself and your organization, here are some steps and stages to go through. Going back to my design with the end in mind, always start with what you're trying to achieve. And it can be just as simple as I want to create a greater alignment of my organization between employee and customer interactions and strategies. So start with that. Okay, what are you trying to achieve? What are your objectives? What are your outcomes? And then look at the experiences. Start to understand where those experiences are. How do they intersect? What is important in all of those? Think about your surveys, but don't just think about your surveys. Think about the additional data. Think about the metrics, all of the stuff that's available to you to help you achieve that. Think about timeframes and linkage points, especially if you want to start doing it from what I would call a more kind of modeling perspective. Think about timeframes, think about the audiences. And the audiences are really important because going back to kind of Grace's point, we want to bring people along with us. But who needs to see what, where, when, and how? And finally, think about those stakeholders and internal alignment. It was really interesting, the statistic this morning, I think they said something like 95% were collecting and only 10% were actioning. There's been so many discussions about it, but when our organization is aligned, when we bring the right people together, when we have that right buy-in from all the way from the top to the bottom, that is where we're going to start being successful. That is where we're going to convert this information into insight and, importantly, into actions that are going to help us deliver against our brand promise. So thank you all very much. We are now done for the day. Is there any exciting questions?
Just one question about some of the stats that you shared, which were fascinating. Are those from your studies? Is that, like, if I were to quote any of them, is that Medallia research or other?
It's a little mix of both, but when we provide the deck, we're going to provide the slides at the end. The sources should be on. It should be as an appendix in there.
I had another question. So I was one of the people who didn't raise my hand when we were saying if CX is linked to EX at our business. So I'm pretty positive we're collecting some EX from our call center, but we don't have that in Medallia right now. Our store ops partners, so we're retail, Bath and Body Works. But I was just curious because like some of this feels like customer care is really easy, right? It's one-on-one.
Yep.
Employee customer experience. But then I was thinking, like, if you're, like, how far does the employee experience go? Like, should we be looking at our corporate employee experience and then tied as well to the customer care employee experience? And then the front line, I almost think is probably the most important place. But, like, are you bringing all three of those employee groups together for, like, a full company picture? Or is it kind of like they're a little bit separate, or like you have to do the analysis separate to see like where is the overlap?
So it's yes and.
Yes and.
Yes and. So it does. There's a lot of value in looking at things globally, but then also understanding. So if you think about your employee as an internal customer, is that customer, the employee who's now an internal customer, getting the support that they need? So understanding based on the group that you're looking at. So we'll start at the bottom line. So where does this group get everything that they need in order to be successful? And so that's where you would want to then say, so is this group in corporate, our training group, are they doing a good job of giving them the right training? The IT team, are they taking care of their tickets, their technology pieces? So it's really kind of understanding at that core group, which is that group that touches the customer on a daily basis, and then working backwards to understand all the different touch points that they have in order to be successful, or that they need, in order to be successful.
But you are right. The easiest place to start, I'm going to be honest, with the linkage analysis is where you have direct customer to employee. It is an easier place to start. And it goes back to exactly what Grace was saying. As you start going into second line, it's more important to map how second line affects front line. Again, and that there becomes a communication piece. And then again, how can you align those? But there was a different mirroring study that we actually did, and it was associated with mortgage applications because yes, there's a frontline status to it, but actually there's a lot that happens past that makes a big difference. So when we actually did the mirroring for that, yes, we talked to frontline who are dealing with customers, but we also mapped where else in the organization that it touched. And then we went to those parts of the organization and spoke to the employees there to understand. We didn't position it saying, hey, how do you think you're delivering to your customer, or tell us what your customers think. But when you're doing this process, what parts are easy? What parts are hard? What parts do you think can be improved? So like I said, they still have a great perspective and something to add. Wonderful. Well, we've cleared the room.
Yes, there's food out there.
There's food out there.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you,
I really
everyone.
appreciate
Enjoy
your
the rest
time.
of the conference.